Hi, everyone. So, something I'm very interested in um, is undue influence and how people and groups in authority are able to influence their followers to do things that those followers wouldn't ordinarily have done or wouldn't ordinarily have chosen to do without the presence of the influence of their leader. Um, Undue influence explains a lot of how people like dating coaches operate and how they're able to influence their audiences and their followers to adopt their methods, even when those methods might not make sense or when they might go against the person's best interests. And this is something I'm particularly fascinated by. It has a certain amount to do with group dynamics, how people behave when they get into a group or a community. And I spoke a little bit about this on my video on echo chambers. And it also has to do with the various tactics that the leader uses to exercise undue influence or to exert undue influence, I should say. So, my understanding of undue influence is that it's a force which acts on another person in order to persuade them to do things that are against their own free will. It's those factors that interfere with the person exercising their own free will. So, the way I look at it, we all have our own thought processes and principles and opinions and beliefs that determine how we behave. And then you also have physiological factors like our physical needs, safety, our need for food and shelter, and even our need for community with others. All of these are internal factors inside ourselves, which determine how we behave, what we do, the choices that we make. And undue influence is those factors that come along that interfere with our ability to make decisions based on our needs and our beliefs and our opinions and our morals and principles, and even against our what is best for us and what we need and what we want. So I'm always fascinated by personalities who are able to influence large groups of people to act against their own free will. It's very fascinating to me. We see it in MLMs. We see it in toxic online communities, or even conspiracy theory groups. We see it in those in the sort of following of those social media influencers who have very powerful personalities and large followings of very dedicated fans. And in my opinion, we also see it with the likes of coaches, like dating coaches like Matthew Hussey, Adrian Everhart, some of the other dating coaches I plan to cover on my channel. And because of the tactics that these people use, they're able to influence their followings, or they're following their fans to behave in ways that those people might look back on in years to come and think, my goodness, why did I do that? How did I let myself get persuaded into that? And what's particularly interesting to me is that these fans, these followers, are often extremely intelligent, rational people who would consider themselves to be independent, critical thinkers, who are perhaps very rational and reasonable in other areas of their life. And they're susceptible to these personalities and these groups. and influenced by them. And I think it's really, really important to study the ways in which undue influence is exercised so that we can avoid these falling into these sorts of traps of being influenced by these powerful personalities as much as possible. Because although it's not a bad thing to learn from others, in fact, I'd argue it's a wonderful thing. The internet is a fantastic place for gaining information and using that information to shape your opinions and beliefs. At the same time, we should always be cautious of coming to our own conclusions and really weighing up all the evidence and information that's available, and coming to a really informed decision, and not allowing ourselves to be overly swayed by someone we might admire, or getting swept up in emotions and in these tactics that I'm going to talk about, which can cause us to veer away from things that might actually be best for us and things we might actually believe. So I do think that it's really important to study these strategies because none of us are immune to them. I myself, I'd regard myself as a critical thinker. I was raised in a very academic family, and I was always encouraged to exercise critical thinking skills by my parents, by the school that I went to. These were environments that heavily encouraged debate and questioning and critically analyzing things. And yet I myself have certainly been drawn into echo chambers and, been unduly influenced by people and communities in the past. And it's something I'm still susceptible to. All of us are. And the way that you reduce your susceptibility or your vulnerability to being unduly influenced is that you learn about the tactics that are used. So that's what I'm hoping to achieve with my videos about dating coaches. And I thought it would be really cool to do a series of videos about the strategies that are used in order to exert undue influence. And we can study them together, maybe start with the simpler strategies and move up to some of the more complex strategies as we go along in the series. And today I thought I'd start with a really common strategy that we see on the internet quite a lot these days, and it's something. Although it's fairly easy to spot, it's something that is surprisingly powerful, and it's surprisingly easy to get hooked by this strategy. You might have heard of it. It's called the ad hominem attack. That's what I'm going to look at today. And we're going to look at an example of an ad hominem attack and how it works. How it tries to, how people who use ad hominem attacks try to exert undue influence on others. But first, let's have a look at a definition of undue influence. I looked for, a few different definitions online, and the one that I liked the most came from Investopedia. So let's have a look at this one. What is undue influence? Undue influence occurs when an individual is able to persuade another's decisions due to the relationship between the two parties. Often, one of the parties is in a position of power over the other due to elevated status, higher education, or emotional ties. The more powerful individual uses this advantage to coerce the other individual into making decisions that might not be in their long-term best interest. So that's what I talked about. Undue influence is harmful because it is actually able to persuade a person to act in ways that are not in their best interests and that might actually be quite harmful to them. Either their physical, mental health, their relationships, their success, their life, just their general well-being. And that's why it's particularly important to be on the lookout for undue influence. Undue influence is an equitable doctrine that involves one person taking advantage of a position of power over another person. This inequity in power between the parties can vitiate one party's consent, as they are unable to freely exercise their independent will. Right, so in an ideal situation where there is a discussion or an exchange between two people or two parties, both parties should be exercising their free will and giving consent. But undue influence actually interferes with consent and free will. And so you can see how it can become insidious and how it can become coercive. So then it says, in exerting undue influence, the influencing individual is often able to take advantage of the weaker party. That's another important distinction to make. There's almost always some sort of power disparity between the two parties. Not always. You can have undue influence acting between two people who are on equal footing, but usually there's some sort of power disparity. One party or person is slightly above the other in some significant way, and that power disparity causes the person in the weaker position to defer to that person who's in the higher position. And that is how the undue influence starts. The weaker party is predisposed to believe or trust the stronger party. So it says in contract law, a party claiming to be the victim of undue influence may be able to void the terms of the agreement. Okay, so undue influence is even recognized by the law. If it interferes with a person's ability to properly consent to a contract or to an agreement, you can actually use undue influence to show that the contract or agreement is not valid. So undue influence is definitely a real concern, so much so that most legal systems recognize the power of undue influence. So it says key takeaways. Undue influence most commonly occurs when a more powerful party exerts its influence over a less powerful party in order to achieve its desired outcome. Depending on the measure of influence and if there were any extraneous factors involved, some agreements can be legally voided. Undue influence varies widely in size, from the basic favor to multi-billion-dollar transactions. And we also see undue influence all over the internet. It can even occur on on a very small scale in exchanges between people online. So then it says undue influence occurs when an individual is able to use an advantage to coerce another party's decisions. Often, this coercion occurs to the detriment of the weaker party and the gain of the more powerful or influential party. And that's another sure way to know whether undue influence is taking place. Is the more powerful party benefiting at the expense of the weaker party? Because no one uses undue influence to, if it's not some sort of benefit to themselves. Generally, these sorts of tactics are used in order to get the other person to do something that's going to benefit them. Otherwise, people just simply wouldn't bother. They wouldn't go to this kind of trouble because undue influence is manipulative. And unless you just simply enjoy manipulating people for the sake of it, usually people who exert undue influence realize that they can actually get advantages and benefits from other people by using undue influence. So it says some relationships, such as one between a patient and a doctor or parent and child, are considered to run the risk of undue influence and are legally outlined. So the law actually recognizes how certain relationships are susceptible to undue influence, and that's why there are certain rules and laws in place to govern how those relationships should work. It's to protect the weaker party. There are plenty of other examples of relationships that are susceptible to undue influence. And one of those is the one that we're going to look at today in the example. So it says in other situations, one party, based on previous interactions, can be accused of using the trust of the other party to his advantage. An example of undue influence. For example, Bert is Ernie's therapist. Bert is also involved in a couple of real estate development deals around town. Ernie starts talking to Bert about how he has heard about units for sale in the complex that Bert is invested in developing. Ernie isn't interested and doesn't feel it's appropriate for him to purchase a home at that time, but feels left behind by his friends who are all purchasing units or making investments in the project. Bert uses his place of power over Ernie to convince him that it's a good step forward in his life, also to make an investment in the project. This is to Ernie's financial detriment, but it increases the value of Bert's investment. Bert has used undue influence. Okay, so that's undue influence. And hopefully that gives you a bit of an idea of what we're dealing with. So I want to look at today in this video, I want to look at an example of undue influence that is particularly fascinating to me. For those of you who don't know who Leah Remini is, let me just take a drink. She is a Hollywood actress who's also an ex-Scientologist. She was involved in the Church of Scientology for over 20 years, if I'm not mistaken, and she was heavily involved, fairly high up in the church, I believe. And the Church of Scientology is known for really, taking advantage of their celebrity followers, or really kind of milking the fact that they have a celebrity follower. When someone in Hollywood becomes a Scientologist, that it is a big deal for the Church of Scientology. Leah Remini has since got out of Scientology, and she's made a documentary series on the A&E network called Scientology and the Aftermath. It's a brilliant documentary series. I would highly recommend going and watching it. But what was interesting to me is how the Church of Scientology responded to her documentary. Now, the Church of Scientology, I think it's pretty well known because of all the information that has come out, that the Church of Scientology is a very high control group that definitely exerts undue influence over its members. And one of the ways that you can tell that a group is a high control group, or a cult even, and that it exerts undue influence, is by how it responds to its critics. So none of us on earth are immune to criticism, or we shouldn't be. And how you handle criticism and allegations against you says a great deal about your moral substance and about the extent to which you can and should be trusted. It's a dead giveaway. But I think what is interesting for our purposes is the particular strategy that the Church of Scientologists uses to try and discredit Leah Remini. It's called the ad hominem attack, and we're going to see lots of examples of ad hominems in this response statement that they've put out about Leah Remini and all her allegations against the Church of Scientology. Now, as I mentioned, Leah Remini's documentary is it exposes the abuses and horrific things that go on behind the scenes in Scientology. And she uses plenty of people's testimonies and stories to back up what she's saying, including her own experience. So she's not just throwing out, baseless allegations. It's not just her opinion. She provides plenty of evidence to support what she's saying about Scientology. And I think it's very interesting when you compare her methods of making allegations against the Church of Scientology with what the Church of Scientology is saying about her. So before we look at the statement that they've put out, what is an ad hominem attack? The words ad hominem are Latin for at the person, and it means that it's a personal attack. So ad hominems are when, if you use an ad hominem, you are attacking a person on a personal level rather than addressing what they're saying. So, for example, if I say the government of Russia is corrupt, and then a government official comes out and says, well, in response to my allegation that they're corrupt, an official says, well, you, I can't even think of a good example. So they could say, well, you're ugly. So that's an attack on me as a person, and it's not addressing anything that I've actually said. So that would be an example of an ad hominem. An ad hominem is where you attack either a person's personal life, how they look, things that they've done or said that are completely unrelated to the argument that you're having. It's just any way that you can try and sling mud at the person making the argument or the allegation. And it really shouldn't work, but it does, unfortunately. So let's have a look at this example of what the Church of Scientology has said about Leah Remini, because I just think it's such a fascinating and obvious example of an ad hominem attack. And hopefully, if you've never heard of ad hominem attacks before, hopefully it will become clearer to you as we read this statement. So let me just pull that up. Okay. So I pulled this from Scientology Newsroom. This is Scientology's own website. And it's worth noting that the Church of Scientology has made numerous attempts to get Leah Remini's documentary, Scientology in the Aftermath, pulled from the A&E networks. They've tried to threaten the network. They've tried to file legal action to get the documentary pulled. Because obviously it paints Scientology in an extremely unfavorable light. Leah Remini's documentary has been instrumental in educating the public about what Scientology is really all about and the abuses that go on in the Church of Scientology. And so it stands to reason a high control group like Scientology is going to want to do everything in their power to either get the documentary pulled altogether or to discredit the people involved in the documentary, however they can. Now, it's really interesting that they go after her as a person, and that's what we'll see in this statement, and why it's such a good example of an ad hominem attack. So, Church of Scientology statement concerning Leah Remini. It says, Leah Remini has become what she once declared she never wanted to be known as, this bitter ex-Scientologist. So right off the bat, their very first sentence is an attack on her. They're calling her a bitter ex-Scientologist. And this is so interesting because they're coming in strong with their attacking language, hoping that this will give readers that it will predispose readers to regard anything that Leah Remini says with skepticism. Then it says, as USA Today wrote, Miss Remini is as famous for being an ex-Scientologist as she is as an actress. So that's probably true. I mean, she is probably as famous for being an ex-Scientologist as she is for being an actress. And by making this statement, the Church of Scientology is hoping to imply that the only reason that Leah Remini would be putting out this documentary is to earn fame, is to become even more famous than she was, and that she's using her connection to Scientology to further her own career. It's so interesting to me. Then she says, she needs to move on with her life instead of pathetically exploiting her former religion, her former friends, and other celebrities for money and attention to appear relevant again. Now, what I find fascinating about that statement is they say she needs to move on with her life. I think one could argue that Leah Remini is moving on with her life, and this is how she's doing it. She was obviously very traumatized by her time in the Church of Scientology, and making this documentary is clearly as much of a therapeutic and healing journey for herself as it is to educate other people. And so this is ironic because I would say she is definitely moving on with her life, and she's doing so in a very productive and positive way. And here they're implying that she isn't moving on with her life, that she's, exploiting her former religion, and that's not somehow moving on with her life. But can you see how, if you're not actually examining the words critically, this could start to make you think, oh, well, yeah, like she is exploiting her time in the Church of Scientology. She is exploiting people she used to know and her connections to Scientology in order to make this documentary and to become famous. And if you're not looking at it from all sides, this might actually start to kind of cause you to question Leah Remini's intentions. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it's very important to really look at it in a more holistic and balanced way, to look at all sides of the statement before you just take it on. Before we go any further with this statement, I just want to point out this statement is going to be primarily for the benefit of people who are actually in the Church of Scientology and not for people who are outside the church, because I think the majority of people who are outside of the Church of Scientology already have a certain negative opinion of it, and they're probably already going to regard anything that the Church of Scientology says with skepticism. So most people outside of the church are not going to be very persuaded by this statement that's being put out, but it's where people who are actually in the church are going to be directed if they ask questions about Leah Remini. Say they've heard of the documentary, or they might have even seen it, and they go to the Church of Scientology wanting to know how it is responding to the allegations that she's making. And they're going to be directed to this website. And this is what they're going to read. And these are people who are already invested in the Church of Scientology, and they're already predisposed to believe what the church says. So I just want you, as we read the statement, to keep that in mind. Okay, so the next paragraph says, Sadly, bitterness and anger are common threads through Miss Remini's life. Miss Remini is showing herself to be a spoiled, entitled diva who still obsessively complains about such petty matters as her seating placement, limo ride, five-star hotel accommodations, and the paparazzi's failure to recognize her nearly a decade ago. This is funny to me because they're painting her as a diva, and you know, they're pulling little bits and pieces of complaints that Leah Remini might have made at some point. I don't know if she has or not, but they're pulling these little threads together in order to paint a picture of her as a diva who's entitled and spoiled, and is self-absorbed and just wants to be famous. Says she also inserts herself uninvited into the family matters of others. If I'm not mistaken, what they're referring to here is the way that she talks about how the Church of Scientology separates family members. So I think it's fairly well known that if you have family members, if you are in the Church of Scientology and you have family members who leave, the church encourages you to cut contact with those people, if not basically coerces you to cut contact with family members who are no longer in the Church of Scientology. So they are, I think it's a veiled reference to when they say family matters, it's the allegations that Leah Remini makes on the documentary about how the Church of Scientology basically tears families apart. And then it says, rather than take responsibility for self-inflicted problems, she is quick to blame others. When her firing from The Talk erupted into a public embarrassment for her in 2012, we tried to help pick her up off the floor, but she treated everyone around her in a degrading, bullying manner. Her behavior was intolerable. Notice how they don't give a single example of this. They don't provide any evidence whatsoever. It's, they're just mudslinging at Leah Remini, which is really interesting. Leah Remini knows the truth she conveniently rewrites in her revisionist history. The real story is that she desperately tried to remain a Scientologist in 2013, knowing full well she was on the verge of being expelled for refusing to abide by the high level of ethics and decency Scientologists are expected to maintain. Her repeated ethical lapses and callous treatment of others led to an ecclesiastical review, which resulted in her being expelled. Again, not a single example, not a single piece of evidence is being given here. She now regurgitates the tired myths the church has repeatedly debunked, circulated by the same tiny clique of expelled former staffers, bitter at having lost the positions they enjoyed before their malfeasance and unethical conduct were uncovered. Miss Remini is now joined at the hip with this collection of deadbeats, admitted liars, self-admitted perjurers, wife-beaters, and worse. So these are classic ad hominem attacks, calling people liars, deadbeats, wife-beaters, perjurers, bitter, all this sort of thing, yet providing no examples, providing no evidence to show that this is true. This is the heart of an ad hominem attack. And these are very obvious ad hominem attacks. What I think is really interesting is that the Church of Scientology is just slinging as much mud as it can at these people, and not acknowledging any credit or merit in what they're saying at all. And that's another dead giveaway of a high control group or of undue influence. When a person discredits someone else in their entirety without giving them credit for any points or any good arguments that they might have made, there's absolutely no yielding or leeway or credit being given for anything that was said in the documentary. They're just tossing the whole thing out and saying the whole thing is garbage. And because we say that these people are liars and perjurers, etc., who are better, nothing that they say should be trusted. It's fascinating to me. Then it goes on to say, Miss Remini also continues her obnoxious efforts to harass the leader of the Church of Scientology and his wife. That's David Miscavige. Just an interesting side note about David Miscavige and his wife. He has not made a public appearance since the 90s, and his wife has not been seen in public since 2007. She hasn't been seen really by anyone who's admitted to having seen her in 16 years. So I just thought that was interesting to point out. With whom Miss Remini has been obsessed and has stalked for years. Just gotta love this language. This culminated in a scandalous report filed in 2013 with the Los Angeles Police Department that her book shows was a fraud from the outset. It was solely intended to get publicity and harass the leader of the religion and his wife, who had refused contact with Ms. Remini because of her disgraceful behavior that was both abusive and unethical. This is another thing to watch out for. When someone makes allegations about the intentions of others, it's important to regard what they say with skepticism, because none of us can actually know the intentions of other people. We can only make deductions or come to conclusions based on actions and things that we can actually see. None of us can actually know what the intentions of another actually are. So here, where the statement is saying that the police report that Leah Remini filed against David Miscavige and his wife was solely intended to get publicity, they can't possibly know that. They, again, they're just slinging mud and hoping it sticks. They're just hoping that the position of authority of the Church of Scientology is enough to make the readers of this statement believe what they're saying. Ms. Remini also outrageously touts that the LAPD failed to do its job when it investigated her phony report and within hours unambiguously declared it as unfounded, causing her stunt to blow up in her face. Anyone knowingly making a false report to law enforcement is a bold-faced liar who should be held accountable for diverting police from protecting the public. Scientology is the only major religion to be founded in the 20th century and emerge as a major religion in the 21st century. The church has grown more in the past decade than in its first 50 years combined under the ecclesiastical leadership of Mr. Miscavige. A visionary, parishioners and church staff hold in the highest regard for carrying out the legacy of the Scientology founder through the renaissance the religion is now experiencing. So this is another interesting element to an ad hominem attack. Not only do ad hominem attacks seek to sling mud at the person they're directed at, but it's usually followed by painting the person making the ad hominem attack in a glorious and glowing light, saying, well, this person is so awful and look how wonderful I am. And usually neither one of those are based in any sort of evidence. No examples are given. It's just, well, this is how it is. The other thing that I think is interesting is that they say that the church has grown more in the past decade than it in its first 50 years combined, and that the religion is experiencing a renaissance. But again, no evidence is given, and it's been shown many times that the Church of Scientology tends to greatly exaggerate its success and it's the amount that it's grown, just in order to make it seem as if it's taking over the planet and reaching lots of people, and it's nonsense. They have been shown to falsify their statistics and lie about how much the religion has grown. In actual fact, it's it's waning. I know that there are still plenty of Scientologists in the world, and it is still a major religion. However, the whole doctrine of Scientology depends on this idea that they're expanding and reaching millions of people, and so they put this out to their members as being true, even though it's not. So it says, Mr. Miscavige works tirelessly for the parishioners and their benefit, and to aid millions through support and participation in global humanitarian initiatives and social betterment programs. The real story of the Church of Scientology, what it does, its beliefs and practices, is available at www.scientology.org. And what I think is absolutely fascinating about this statement, the most fascinating thing about this statement to me, is that they haven't addressed a single allegation that Leah Remini makes in the documentary. They haven't addressed one single piece of evidence that she puts forth in what she says about Scientology in her documentary and in interviews, and in, the way that she's very outspoken about the Church of Scientology, and they haven't addressed a single one of her claims or allegations. They've just simply tried to attack her as a person. And hopefully you can see how the entire statement is an attempt to completely divert attention away from the documentary and the allegations itself and onto Leah Remini and attacking her in her personal capacity, which is completely irrelevant to what she has said about the church. They're not trying to discredit or disprove anything that she said. And I also think it's interesting that towards the end of the statement, they talk about how wonderful David Miscavige is and all the things that he's done, to help humanity, and how he tirelessly works for the church and its parishioners, and how they all hold him in high regard. And again, that's completely irrelevant to any of the allegations that Leah Remini has made against the Church of Scientology. A religion can do a lot of good, and I'm not saying that the Church of Scientology hasn't done some good. I mean, I know that they have participated in some humanitarian efforts, not nearly as much as what they would like you to believe, but I think at the lower levels, Scientologists do really believe that they're doing good, but that in no way takes away from the abuses that have happened and the absolutely horrific ways that Scientology has played out, and the horrific things that David Miscavige and those in the leadership of Scientology have done, and how they've brainwashed people, and the enormous mental and physical harm that's been caused. The two do not cancel each other out, and the one does not discredit the other. The Church of Scientology has been unable to successfully discredit or disprove the allegations made against them because they can't. So I hope that you've enjoyed this, and I hope that through this example, you've gained a better understanding of what ad hominem attacks are, how they work, why they're used, and how to spot them and look out for them, and how to challenge them as well. It's really important when we see ad hominem attacks to say, oh, wait, hang on a minute. you haven't actually addressed what this person's argument is. You haven't addressed their claims or their allegations. You are trying to change the subject, and you're trying to divert attention away from the main point that this person is making. We can say all kinds of things about one another on a personal level, but it's very important that as critical thinkers, we train ourselves to focus on the content and the substance of what people are actually saying and doing. So that's why an ad hominem attack is harmful. It's why it's detrimental. It's why we really need to be on guard against ad hominem attacks, because they attempt to bypass our critical thinking system and get us to focus on the person rather than the substance of what they're saying. So I hope you enjoyed that. I hope it was enlightening, and I will see you in my next video. Bye. Have a great Monday.